Before we get started with the plot, we ought to look back to the previous segment and look to someone who we had referenced that The Lord of the Rings obviously had an effect on. Becca Tarnas is a modern example of someone being led away from the message of Christ in the place of New Age cosmology influenced by The Lord of the Rings. Let's take the time to listen to what she has to say about Middle-earth and the influence it had on her as she guests on the channel Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio.
But let's start with you, Becca. Tell us about when you in your life first encountered Tolkien and Lord of the Rings and what it did to you.
Well, when I was 9 years old, I was in a Waldorf school in San Francisco, and my grade school teacher read us The Hobbit. She read it out loud, and I think there was something actually important in that it was coming in this oral spoken manner, and that I got to hear the sounds of the names and the descriptions. I wasn't reading them. I was just absorbing it through my ears. And I was completely enchanted by the story and had this profound sense that I had experienced this before, that I'd been in Middle-earth before, Mirkwood, Rivendell, the Lonely Mountain. These names called something forward in me that felt more like remembrance than something that I was encountering for the first time, even though I was encountering it for the first time. And I was fascinated by that feeling. Of course, at 9 years old, I didn't have the language to describe it in that way. And I came home and I shared this with my mother, and she said, "Oh, wait till you read The Lord of the Rings." And I actually got an image right when she said that. I remember it very clearly. This image arose through my imagination of 3 overlapping rings. And behind it, there was a great tree, and there was a sunset in the distance. And I didn't think that much of it, but that was the image that I associated with the title, The Lord of the Rings, until I read it. And that was when I was 13 years old for the first time. And it completely overtook my imagination. I had never been swept so deeply into a story. And I had this profound experience of feeling like I was living my life as a teenager in California. And at the same time, overlaid over that life was Middle-earth, was the memory and feeling and the emotional experience of this profound story. And I just kept pursuing it further and started reading everything that I could get my hands on that Tolkien had written. I was a little bit in denial that Tolkien was an author, a person who had lived at a certain time in history, let alone the 20th century. I wanted to experience this more as received myth. And I delved into the languages as well, wanted to learn Elvish and the Tengwar script, and just totally absorbed myself in that world. And it's something that has stayed with me since. And I had the fortune of being able to, I guess you could say, mature that fascination or bring it to the next level when I started studying Tolkien's work in graduate school and in the context of the philosophy of imagination.
We can see that when she was a child, Middle-earth captivated her imagination. Rather than being brought to the words of God, she developed a fascination in Tolkien's fantasy novels, which did not bring her closer to the Lord, but farther from him. Now let us listen to another clip and pay close attention to how she describes Tolkien and his development of the series.
Yeah, I had a question. You brought up Simon Magus, and Tolkien was known to be very devout Catholic, and yet there are so many Gnostic elements to the Lord of the Rings. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, we can especially see that in his cosmogony, his creation myth, the Ainu Lindale, or the music of the Ainur, which he first wrote in 1919 and then went on to revise over the next several decades. And those Gnostic elements, that really makes me wonder how much, again, to use this phrase, how much was coming through him rather than being consciously or externally influenced. And I haven't come across any evidence of whether Tolkien was reading any Gnostic texts. Of course, Gnostic texts were available to Jung even before he wrote his Red Book. Of course, many more emerged later on, the Nag Hammadi library and so forth. But from what I have come across, and I'm certainly open to correction and hearing others research in this area, I don't know if Tolkien was externally influenced by any Gnostic texts, which brings up instead something of an internal influence, that whatever the spirit was that moved the Gnostics and informed their spiritual experiences and expressions of those experiences may also have been informing Tolkien. There's a living myth there that can't conform to Catholic dogma as it had been codified by the time Tolkien was living by it. And so in that way, maybe there's a contradiction, or maybe we're seeing simply the inner and outer, the esoteric and the exoteric expressions of a deeper interconnected tradition.
It is possible that Tarnis was not familiar with the friends that Tolkien surrounded himself with and the Gnostic influence they would have had on him. But did you notice how she said, whatever the spirit was that moved the Gnostics and informed their spiritual experiences and expressions of those experiences may have also been informing Tolkien? Why would she say that, unless there was an uncanny parallel to the Gnostic world they espoused and the world of Tolkien? She also brought up the idea, to bring up her exact words, in reference to Tolkien's Catholic beliefs, that maybe we're seeing simply the inner and outer, the esoteric and the exoteric expressions of a deeper interconnected tradition. What could she mean by that? She couldn't possibly be implying that Tolkien was not only writing a Gnostic story, but that all of this is connected with the inner workings of Roman Catholicism? Yet again, this is exactly what she is implying. Consider how Tolkien viewed his own writings. He said, "I am not a model of scholarship, but in the matter of the Third Age, I regard myself as a recorder only." In another such case, he says, "I am historically minded. Middle-earth is not an imaginary world." Tolkien's biographer details, he explains it all in great detail, talking about his book not as a work of fiction, but as a chronicle of actual events. He seems to see himself not as an author who has made a slight error that must now be corrected or explained away, but as a historian who must cast light on an obscurity in a historical document. Finally, Tolkien said about his fantasy novels, "It is written in my lifeblood, such as that is, thick or thin, and I can no other. Why would Tolkien take Middle-earth so seriously if it is indeed just fictitious works of fantasy? One could interpret that Tolkien was saying he believed Middle-earth is a real place, which wouldn't be surprising considering how much of an influence devil spirits had on the writer, but could it be possible that Tolkien, and his quotations demon of invention, was trying to say something in his novels about our world through Middle-earth? And if so, where would Tolkien's Catholicism come into play?